This is the story of how the United States military launched airstrikes on Venezuela, captured its president, and potentially changed the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere forever. On January 3, 2026, President Donald Trump ordered what he called a large-scale strike against Venezuela, resulting in the capture of Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores in a nighttime raid that involved over 150 aircraft and 15,000 American troops. Let me take you through exactly what happened, how we got here, and what it all means. The night everything changed. Around 2 in the morning local time, on January 3, 2026, U.S. military helicopters descended on Caracas, Venezuela, flown by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, known as the Night Stalkers, and carrying members of Delta Force, one of America's most elite special operations units. Flying at just 100 feet above the water until reaching Venezuelan shores kept them below radar detection, and as they approached Caracas, U.S. forces disabled Venezuela's air defense systems while the lights in the city went dark, due to what Trump later described as a certain expertise that we had. Inside Miraflores Palace in downtown Caracas, Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were asleep and had no idea what was coming. American forces dragged the couple out of their bedroom in the middle of the night, according to sources who spoke to CNN, and Trump later revealed that Maduro tried to reach a steel-reinforced safe room, but couldn't make it to the door because the team moved too fast. While this raid was happening, over 150 aircraft from 20 bases hit targets across the Venezuelan capital, with F-35 and F-22 fighter jets and B-1 bombers from the Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps striking Fort Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex, along with Miranda Air Base, La Guaira Port, and communication antennas in Cerro El Volcán. Witnesses posted videos online showing large plumes of black smoke and the sky turning fiery red, and at least 5 warehouses at La Guaira Port were destroyed, alongside multiple shipping containers, burned vehicles, and a blown-up security post. The entire operation lasted approximately 2 hours and 20 minutes, before Maduro and Flores were taken aboard the USS Iwo Jima and flown to Naval Station Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, then transported to New York aboard a Department of Justice aircraft. Trump posted his announcement on Truth Social at approximately 4:30 in the morning Eastern Time, stating that the United States had successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, who had been captured along with his wife and flown out of the country. Operation Absolute Resolve was complete. The 25-year criminal case. To understand why this happened, we need to go back decades, because the charges against Maduro didn't appear overnight but represent a case building since 1999. On March 26, 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Nicolas Maduro and 14 other Venezuelan officials on serious charges of narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons violations, with Attorney General William Barr describing Venezuela under Maduro as plagued by criminality and corruption, and accusing him of conspiring to wage a health war on American citizens. The superseding indictment filed on January 3, 2026, the same day as the raid, added even more detail and named 6 defendants: Nicolas Maduro, his wife Celia Flores, his son Nicolas Ernesto Maduro Guerra, known as Nicolasito, and 3 other Venezuelan officials. Starting as early as 1999, according to the indictment, Maduro partnered with international drug trafficking organizations, including Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, the Zetas, Colombian narco-terrorist groups, and the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, and between 2006 and 2008, while serving as foreign minister, he allegedly sold Venezuelan diplomatic passports to known drug traffickers and facilitated diplomatic cover for planes used by money launderers. The State Department estimated that between 200 and 250 tons of cocaine were trafficked through Venezuela annually by 2020, which is enough cocaine to supply millions of users, and the indictment states that for over 25 years, leaders of Venezuela have abused their positions of public trust and corrupted once legitimate institutions to import tons of cocaine into the United States. Between 2004 and 2015, Maduro and his wife allegedly ordered kidnappings, beatings, and murders against people who owed them drug money, which means they weren't just enabling drug trafficking, but actively participating in it. The charges carry severe penalties, with the narco-terrorism and cocaine importation conspiracy charges, each carrying maximum sentences of life in prison, with mandatory minimums of 20 and 10 years respectively, and the firearms charges carrying a 30-year minimum prison term. Maduro's arraignment is expected on Monday, January 6, 2026. The U.S. government wanted him badly enough to put a bounty on his head that started at $15 million in 2020, increased to $25 million in January 2025 under the Biden administration, then jumped to $50 million in August 2025 under Trump, making it one of the highest rewards ever offered by the U.S. government. The months of planning. This operation didn't happen overnight, but represented the culmination of months of intelligence gathering and military planning that began in August 2025, when the CIA covertly installed a small team inside Venezuela to track Maduro's movements. These agents provided detailed intelligence about where he slept, what he ate, and where he traveled. The kind of human intelligence that's incredibly difficult to obtain and maintain in a country like Venezuela, where the government is paranoid about American spies. Preparations for the raid began in earnest by mid-December 2025, and General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said the operation took several months to plan and represented the culmination of months of planning and rehearsal, with special operations forces practicing the raid repeatedly and working out every detail and every contingency. The operation was ready to go in early December, but they were waiting for the right weather conditions because bad weather could doom a mission like this. And helicopters flying at 100 feet over water in a storm would be catastrophic. Meanwhile, the Trump administration was applying increasing pressure on Venezuela through other means, launching what would later be called Operation Southern Spear in September 2025, a campaign targeting boats suspected of drug trafficking in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific that killed at least 115 people. In late December 2025, the CIA carried out a strike against a dock area inside Venezuela used by drug cartels, and the Coast Guard's deployable specialized forces conducted tactical boardings of oil tankers carrying sanctioned Venezuelan crude, so the noose was tightening. On November 25, 2025, the Trump administration declared Maduro the head of a foreign terrorist organization, which wasn't just symbolic, but provided additional legal authority for military action. And they designated the Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, as a foreign terrorist organization on July 25, 2025. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated clearly that Maduro was not the president of Venezuela, and his regime was not the legitimate government, but rather the head of the Cartel de los Soles, a narco-terror organization. Troops were staged and ready by late December, with the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier positioned in the region along with several destroyers and more than 15,000 U.S. troops spread throughout the Caribbean. Trump said publicly on December 23, 2025, that it would be smart for Maduro to leave power, and then before the attack, according to reports, Trump called Maduro privately giving him one last chance to step down, but Maduro refused. At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, January 2, 2026, Trump gave the final approval, telling military leaders good luck and Godspeed, and the operation was a go. The political context. You can't understand this operation without understanding Venezuela's political situation, because in July 2024, Maduro declared himself the victor in Venezuela's presidential election. Despite evidence to the contrary, and the United States, the European Union, Brazil, Colombia, and Chile all denounced the election as fraudulent. Many countries refused to recognize Maduro as legitimately elected, but despite the widespread condemnation, Maduro was inaugurated on January 10, 2025, for a third term while opposition leader Maria Corina Machado and opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, who claimed he actually won the election, were pushed aside as Venezuela's democratic institutions effectively collapsed. This created a unique situation for the Trump administration, because they didn't recognize Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, but saw him as a drug trafficker who had stolen an election and was holding a country hostage. And this perspective shaped everything that followed. Trump invoked the Monroe Doctrine repeatedly when discussing the operation, the 1823 policy that essentially states the United States opposes European colonization and interference in the Western Hemisphere, But he put his own spin on it by saying, the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot. And they now call it the Donroe Doctrine, because American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. Whether you agree with that statement or not, it represents a significant shift in American foreign policy toward Latin America. The military achievement. From a purely military perspective, Operation Absolute Resolve was remarkable, and Trump acknowledged the risks by saying, "This is an attack that could have gone very badly and could have cost a lot of people, a lot of dignity, and a lot of equipment." Those worst-case scenarios didn't materialize, though, and Trump said he thinks they had nobody killed because a couple of guys were hit, but came back in and were supposed to be in pretty good shape. Flying helicopters at 100 feet above the Caribbean, penetrating Venezuelan airspace, disabling their air defenses, conducting a precision raid in the capital city, and extracting a head of state while coordinating with over 150 aircraft from 20 bases represents an extraordinary feat of military planning and execution. The operation deliberately happened on the 36th anniversary of the U.S. capture of Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega during Operation Just Cause in 1989. And that timing wasn't accidental because the parallels are obvious, with both operations involving the capture of a drug trafficking head of state from a Latin American country, though the difference is scale and international context. Trump said he was prepared to do a second wave of strikes, but the first wave was so lethal, it wasn't needed, which suggests the military had additional targets ready if Venezuelan forces mounted significant resistance. But that resistance never materialized, possibly because the leadership was captured so quickly. The Venezuelan response. Venezuela's response was immediate, but ultimately ineffective, with Maduro declaring a national state of emergency as explosions began rocking Caracas, while the government condemned what it called the grave military aggression perpetrated by the current government of the United States. With Maduro captured, the Venezuelan government was in chaos, and Vice President Delcy Rodriguez said Maduro's whereabouts were unknown after the attacks before demanding proof of life for Maduro and his wife, and calling the capture an illegal and illegitimate kidnapping, while insisting the country would never be the colony of any nation. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez called for a massive deployment of military forces in Venezuela. But without clear leadership and with their command structure disrupted, this mobilization appeared disorganized. The Venezuelan government described the attacks as imperialist aggression and called for the UN Security Council to be convened, and they got their wish with the Security Council scheduling a meeting for January 5th. But by then, Maduro was already in New York awaiting arraignment. International reactions. The international response was swift and divided sharply along predictable lines, with Latin American countries largely condemning the operation. Colombian President Gustavo Petro called it aggression against Venezuela and Latin America, while urging de-escalation, announcing security forces were being deployed along the Colombian border to prepare for a possible refugee influx, and urging an emergency meeting of the Organization of American States and United Nations. Brazilian President Lula da Silva condemned the U.S. attack, saying the strikes crossed an unacceptable line and set a dangerous precedent, and he said the action evoked the worst moments of interference in Latin America, a reference to decades of U.S. interventions in the region. Mexico called the strikes a violation of the UN Charter and urged an immediate halt to acts of aggression. Chile echoed these condemnations. But Argentina's libertarian president Javier Milei broke from his neighbors by saying "Long live freedom" in support of the operation. Russia condemned the strikes, calling the Trump administration's pretext unfounded and describing the action as an unacceptable assault on Venezuela's sovereignty. But Russia stopped short of challenging the U.S. more forcefully despite months of pressure, and Russia has been a key ally of Venezuela but apparently wasn't willing to risk direct confrontation with the United States over Maduro. China was deeply shocked by what they called the blatant use of force against a sovereign state and argued the action infringed on Venezuela's sovereignty and threatened peace in Latin America and the Caribbean. But like Russia, China's response was limited to words. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the strikes a dangerous precedent and urged adherence to international law. And many world leaders and international law experts said the raid violated the UN Charter and Venezuela's sovereignty. The legal authority for the attack remains murky, with many pointing out that it echoes the 1990 U.S. invasion of Panama, to capture Manuel Noriega, which was also controversial under international law, and this represents the most significant U.S. military intervention in Latin America since that Panama invasion. Domestic political reaction. Back in the United States, reaction was predictably divided along partisan lines, though not entirely, and Republican Representative Mario Diaz-Balart of Florida suggested that tyrannies in Cuba and Nicaragua should know their days are also counted, hinting at possible future operations. Democratic Representative Adam Smith of Washington said the operation has introduced more chaos and instability and accused the Trump administration of giving no consideration or plan for what comes next. While Democratic Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey was furious and accused Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth of lying to Congress by writing that they looked every senator in the eye a few weeks ago and said this wasn't about regime change. The reaction from constitutional conservatives was particularly interesting, with Republican Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky criticizing the action on constitutional grounds by saying that if this action were constitutionally sound, the Attorney General wouldn't be tweeting that they've arrested the president of a sovereign country. Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah initially questioned the constitutionality, but later said Rubio told him the action likely falls within the president's inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution, the article that defines presidential powers. The Trump administration did not notify Congress in advance of the operation, and Secretary of State Rubio confirmed Congress was notified immediately afterward while explaining it's not the kind of mission you can pre-notify because it endangers the mission. This raises questions about executive power and the War Powers Resolution, which requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces to military action. What happens next? So where does Venezuela go from here? And Trump has been surprisingly specific about his plans, though many details remain unclear. We're going to run it essentially, Trump said, until such time that we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And he said Rubio, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and a local team would be running the country, which raises obvious questions about what it means for the United States to run Venezuela, and whether American troops will occupy the country, something Trump didn't rule out but hasn't committed to either. Trump has been particularly focused on Venezuela's oil because Venezuela has 303 billion barrels of oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia or any other country in the world, an enormous resource that decades of mismanagement and corruption have left in terrible condition. Trump said Venezuela's oil business has been a bust, a total bust for a long period of time, and his plan is to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, spend billions of dollars to fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country. Trump said he would get oil flowing and sell it to several countries, with wealth going back to the people of Venezuela and to the US. But critics immediately pointed out that this sounds like colonialism, America seizing control of another country's natural resources, while supporters argue that Venezuela's oil wealth has been stolen by Maduro's regime for years, and that American management could actually benefit ordinary Venezuelans who have suffered under economic collapse. What role will Venezuelan opposition leaders like Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez play? And that's unclear because Trump hasn't specified how or when power would be transferred to Venezuelan leaders. The timeline for all of this is unknown, and whether this is a months-long occupation or years-long, Trump hasn't said. The legal and moral questions. This operation raises profound legal and moral questions that will be debated for years. And from a legal standpoint, the operation exists in a gray area because the U.S. has an indictment against Maduro for drug trafficking and terrorism, and designated him as the head of a foreign terrorist organization. In that framework, this isn't an attack on a legitimate head of state, but the arrest of a wanted criminal who happens to control a country. But international law doesn't really recognize that distinction because Venezuela is a sovereign nation, and conducting military operations on its territory without its government's consent is, under most interpretations, a violation of that sovereignty. The UN Charter generally prohibits the use of force against other nations except in self-defense or with Security Council authorization, and the US had neither. Supporters of the operation argue that Maduro lost legitimacy through the fraudulent 2024 election, and through his transformation of Venezuela into a narco-state, and they argue that the U.S. has the right to defend itself against terrorist organizations and drug traffickers regardless of where they're located, pointing out that Maduro's regime was responsible for flooding American communities with cocaine and for unleashing gang violence through groups like Tren de Aragua. Critics argue that setting this precedent is dangerous because if the United States can capture foreign leaders it disagrees with, what's to stop other powerful nations from doing the same? And what happens when China decides to capture a leader it considers a threat, or when Russia does the same? Because the international order depends on respect for sovereignty. There's also the question of what happens to ordinary Venezuelans, with over 7 million Venezuelans having fled the country in recent years due to economic collapse, and Colombia preparing for another refugee wave, and whether American intervention makes life better or worse for them remains to be seen, because history suggests that foreign military interventions often create chaos before things improve, if they improve at all. The historical context. Putting this in historical context matters because the United States has a long history of intervention in Latin America. And in the 20th century alone, the U.S. was involved in regime change or military intervention in Guatemala, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Chile, Nicaragua, Grenada, Panama, and others. These interventions were often justified on anti-communist grounds during the Cold War, or on drug trafficking grounds afterward, and sometimes they succeeded in their immediate aims but often created long-term problems, with the resentment generated by decades of American intervention in Latin America running deep. The 1989 Panama invasion to capture Manuel Noriega is the closest parallel because, like Maduro, Noriega was indicted on drug trafficking charges. And like Operation Absolute Resolve, Operation Just Cause involved a massive military operation to capture one man, with the U.S. succeeding militarily but facing years of criticism for violating Panamanian sovereignty. What makes this operation different is the scale: over 150 aircraft and 15,000 troops. And the context, because Venezuela isn't a small country like Panama, but a major oil producer with 28 million people that has allies in Russia and China, so the ripple effects of this operation could be far larger. Trump's invocation of the Monroe Doctrine signals a return to a more aggressive American posture in the hemisphere. And whether that's good or bad depends entirely on your perspective and your position in the world. The bigger picture. Stepping back, this operation represents several broader trends converging. And first, it represents a willingness by the Trump administration to use military force more aggressively than recent administrations. With the previous strikes on drug trafficking boats that killed at least 115 people showing Trump was willing to blur traditional lines about the use of force. Second, it represents a hardening American attitude toward drug trafficking. Because the opioid crisis has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, and the flow of fentanyl and cocaine continues, creating political support for aggressive action, even if it means invading other countries. Third, it represents a changing international order, because the U.S. conducted this operation despite objections from major powers like China and Russia. And those countries protested but didn't intervene, which tells us something about the current balance of power and perhaps about how much those countries actually valued their relationship with Maduro. Fourth, it represents ongoing debate about executive power in America because the president ordered military action without congressional approval, and some argue this is necessary in modern warfare, while others see it as unconstitutional. A debate that's old but remains unresolved. Attorney General Pam Bondi stated that Maduro and Flores will soon face the full wrath of American justice on American soil in American courts. And that's a remarkable statement, because a sitting head of state will be prosecuted in New York like any other criminal defendant. Whatever you think about Maduro's guilt, the symbolism is powerful. Conclusion. So here we are, and on January 3rd, 2026, the United States military conducted airstrikes on Venezuela, captured its president and first lady, and initiated what Trump calls a transition process that could last months or years. Operation Absolute Resolve succeeded in its immediate military objective because Nicolás Maduro is in custody facing life in prison on drug trafficking and terrorism charges while the Venezuelan government is in disarray. But the harder questions remain unanswered about what comes next for Venezuela and whether American involvement will improve the situation or make it worse, how other countries will respond, and what precedent has been set. Trump said American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again, and that might be true in military terms because this operation demonstrated that the U.S. can reach anywhere in the hemisphere with overwhelming force. But dominance and legitimacy aren't the same thing. The legal case against Maduro is strong, and the evidence of narco-terrorism and corruption is substantial. So, from that perspective, this is a law enforcement operation. Not a conquest, but it's a law enforcement operation that required over 150 aircraft, 15,000 troops, and the invasion of a sovereign nation. History will ultimately judge whether this operation was justified and whether it improved the lives of Venezuelans and Americans. But in the immediate term, it represents one of the most dramatic uses of American military power in Latin America in over 3 decades. Maduro awaits trial in New York, Venezuela awaits an uncertain future, and the world watches to see if this operation is a one-time event or the beginning of a more aggressive American foreign policy. That's the story of the day America captured Venezuela's president. Thanks for watching.